The neighbors often said that Edward Hale was the kind of man every woman wished for. Polite, handsome in an understated way, always carrying himself with calm restraint, like he belonged to a slower, more dignified era. They saw him watering the roses on Sundays, carrying groceries in neat brown bags, waving with that faint smile that never quite reached his eyes. From the street, he was flawless. Inside the house, the silence told a different story. Edward sat at the dining table, his hands folded too carefully over one another. The meal lay between him and his wife, untouched. The aroma of roasted chicken and herbs filled the air, but neither lifted a fork. The silverware glinted under the overhead lamp, bright against the shadows pooling in the corners of the room. His wife, Margaret, sat opposite. Her face was partially hidden by the angle of the light, her gaze fixed on something beyond him, perhaps the wall, perhaps a thought she'd never share aloud. She spoke little these days, and when she did, her voice was soft, almost weightless, as though she were careful not to disturb the fragile air between them. Edward's jaw tensed. Why won't she look at me? Why won't she say something real? To anyone watching, he looked patient, even gentle. Inside, the questions gnawed like rats at the edges of his calm. Is it not to your liking? He finally asked, gesturing faintly toward the food. Margaret's eyes flickered his way. A momentary glance, then silence. She lifted her glass of water, sipped, and set it back down. The faint clink echoed louder than it should have in the quiet room. He leaned back, shadows cutting across his face, half in light, half in darkness. That smile, the one the neighbors adored, surfaced briefly, but it carried something brittle now, something strained. We used to laugh at this table, he thought. We used to reach for each other without thinking. Where did it go? The clock ticked. His mind replayed scenes that no one else had witnessed. A slammed door 2 weeks ago. The quiet sobbing he had overheard late one night. The drawer she had locked when she thought he wasn't watching. He never asked, never pushed. He only observed, and beneath the observation, unease thickened into something heavier, something darker. Edward rose, pushing his chair back with deliberate calm. I'll be in the study, he said, his tone measured, almost tender. But his eyes lingered on Margaret longer than necessary, as though searching for a trace of emotion. She gave him none. He turned away, steps muffled on the polished floorboards. Behind him, Margaret remained still, her outline blurred by the warm haze of the dining room lamp. The untouched plate sat cooling between them, symbols of a union that looked perfect from the outside, but carried a hollow echo within. From the street, the neighbors would later say they heard nothing unusual that night. No shouting, no broken glass. Just silence. And silence, as Edward Hale knew all too well, could be louder than any scream. To the world, he was the perfect husband. Inside his home, perfection was just another mask. Margaret Hale waited until the study door clicked shut before she moved. The dining room lay in silence, the plates between them still untouched, the air still heavy. She rose, gathered her glass of water, and carried it to the sink. One glass half empty, the other, Edward's, untouched. The sight felt like a metaphor carved into her chest. She walked upstairs, her steps measured, as though afraid the house itself might betray her. In the bedroom, the air was colder, sharper. She reached beneath the bed and drew out a slim leather-bound journal, its edges worn, its lock scratched from hurried opening and closing. Seated at the dressing table, the cracked mirror reflected fragments of her face. One half in shadow, one half in the lamplight, she began to write. Edward's silence frightens me more than his words. He watches, always watching. I can't tell if he loves me anymore or if he's studying me like one of his legal cases, waiting for me to falter. Something is hidden behind that calmness. Something I cannot see, but I feel it pressing in on me. Her pen hesitated. A droplet of ink bled across the page, spreading like a bruise. She closed her eyes, hearing the faint creak of the floorboards. Below, he moved softly, deliberately. Always deliberate, Margaret's chest tightened. There had been a time, years ago, when Edward's restraint had been reassuring. A man who never raised his voice, never let passion cloud his judgment. But restraint had hardened into distance. Distance had become silence. And silence, she knew, could suffocate more than any argument. She wrote again. Her script hurried as though afraid someone might walk in. I found the drawer locked again. Why does he keep it so hidden? He says it's nothing, yet he guards it like a secret life. I want to believe I'm imagining things, but my reflection betrays me. I look at myself and see a woman who is frightened in her own home. The pen scraped louder now, each word a defiance. Yet when she heard Edward's footsteps moving faintly below, she snapped the journal shut and slid it back under the bed. At the dressing table, she lifted her gaze to the cracked mirror. Two versions of her stared back. The composed wife in her silk blouse, elegant, untouchable, and the fractured, fearful woman beneath. She touched the crack with her fingertips, the reflection warping her face into something unrecognizable. A sound from downstairs. The faint clink of a wine bottle, the pouring of glass. Margaret's breath caught. She descended slowly, heart drumming. On the table, two glasses, his brimming red, hers still empty. He looked up when she entered, that faint smile fixed once more. You should drink with me, Edward said lightly, though his tone carried weight. Margaret's hand hovered near the glass, but never lifted it. The silence stretched between them, thick and unspoken, their eyes locked across the table. From the street, the house looked peaceful, just another evening in a perfect marriage. Inside, the silence screamed louder than any words. The wine between them sat untouched. Margaret's hand lingered just above the glass, but she never drank. Edward's smile was faint, practiced, though his eyes had grown sharper in the low light. Silence pressed down on them until the sharp rap of a knock shattered it. Margaret flinched. Edward's gaze flicked toward the door, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Expecting someone? He asked, voice measured. No, Margaret replied softly. The knock came again, firmer this time. Edward rose, his movements precise, controlled, and crossed to the hallway. Margaret remained frozen at the table, heart pounding against her ribs. She heard the lock turn, hinges creak. In the doorway stood a figure, silhouetted against the porch. Light, broad shoulders, a coat damp with evening drizzle, and a voice that carried familiarity. Margaret? The sound of her name from another man's lips unsettled the air like a gunshot. Edward did not move aside. He filled the frame, his posture calm but rigid. Can I help you? The man cleared his throat. I'm Thomas, an old friend. I was passing through and thought I might... His words faltered under Edward's stare. Margaret had risen now, her steps hesitant as she approached the hallway. When she saw him, her breath caught. Thomas, she whispered, her voice breaking. With recognition, the faint smile on Edward's lips thinned into a line. The three stood in silence, the drizzle whispering against the porch roof. Finally, Edward stepped back, motioning stiffly. Come in, then. The living room, once suffocating in its quiet, now thrummed with an uneasy current. Thomas sat, his damp coat folded over the chair, while Edward positioned himself opposite, one leg crossed, hands clasped too neatly in his lap. Margaret perched on the edge of the sofa, as though caught between the two men. It's been years, Thomas said, glancing between them. I hardly recognized you. Margaret smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. I didn't think I'd ever see you again. Edward's gaze flickered between them, sharp and silent. His fingers tapped once against his knee, then stilled. And how exactly do you know my wife? He asked finally. Thomas hesitated. We grew up together. School days, really, nothing more. Edward's lips curved, but the expression was all teeth. Nothing more. The words carried weight, too heavy for their simplicity. Margaret shifted uncomfortably. Edward, but her husband's voice cut across hers. Curious, though, isn't it? A man from the past arriving unannounced at our door. After all this time, Thomas cleared his throat again. I didn't mean to intrude. I was passing through and thought, and yet here you are. Edward interrupted, leaning forward. His fist, unseen beneath the table's edge, clenched. So tightly the knuckles blanched. Margaret's pulse quickened. She could almost feel the pressure building, the words unsaid pressing against the walls. Thomas rose politely, sensing the tension. "Perhaps I should go. I didn't want trouble." Margaret reached out. "No, please." Edward's hand landed gently on hers, but the grip was firm, unyielding. His smile returned, thin as glass. "Yes, it's best not to stay too long." Thomas hesitated at the door, casting one last look at Margaret before disappearing into the drizzle. The house fell silent once more. Edward closed the door with deliberate calm, his back to her. "An old friend," he murmured. "How very convenient." Margaret's breath caught, her throat dry. She knew what was coming, not shouting, never shouting, but the sharper cruelty of words that would follow. And somewhere in the silence a game had begun. The door clicked shut behind Thomas, the drizzle fading into silence. Edward stood with his back to Margaret, hand still resting on the latch as though holding it closed against more than just the night. When he finally turned, his expression was calm. Too calm. "You seemed pleased to see him." Margaret's lips parted, but no words came. Her pulse thudded in her ears. Edward stepped closer, measured, deliberate. "An old friend. Is that what you called him?" "I didn't call him anything," she replied softly. "I was surprised, that's all." His smile flickered, brittle. Surprised? Or delighted? The accusation was soft, almost tender, but it cut sharper than any shout. Margaret shook, her head quickly. "Edward, you're twisting this. He came by chance." He leaned down, his shadow swallowing hers as the lamplight caught her face. "Strange, then, how chance seems to follow you. I wonder why that is." Margaret drew back, clutching her arms. "You're imagining things." Edward straightened, the smile vanishing. "No, Margaret. You're imagining things. You've been on edge for weeks, whispering in your journal, glancing at me as though I were a stranger in my own home. Perhaps you should ask yourself why you feel guilty." Her throat tightened. "Guilty?" "Yes," he murmured, circling slowly behind her chair. "As though you have something to hide." She turned to follow him, but his figure blurred in the shadows, his voice slipping around her like smoke. Later that night, when she retreated to the bedroom, Margaret clutched her phone beneath the covers, its cold glow painting her face in pale light. A single message half-typed to a friend, unsent. "I don't feel safe." Her thumb hovered, but fear pressed it back. Downstairs, Edward watched from the study, his own phone in hand. Her messages, her calls, all redirected quietly to him. He had learned long ago how to trace her digital footsteps. To him, surveillance was simply protection, proof that she could not be trusted. The next morning at breakfast, he spoke lightly, almost kindly. "You shouldn't worry so much, Margaret. It makes you look tired." Her spoon clinked against the bowl. She stared at him, hollow-eyed, unable to respond. He reached across the table, brushing her hand with his fingertips. The touch was gentle, but beneath it lay steel. "We're stronger together when you trust me. You do trust me, don't you?" Margaret forced a nod, but her silence betrayed her. Edward leaned back, satisfied. On the surface, control had shifted in his favor. Yet beneath, cracks deepened, cracks that could no longer be hidden. And that night, when the house was dark, Margaret pressed her recorder beneath the sheets. The game had changed. The nights in the Hale household had grown heavier. Margaret lay awake beside Edward, listening to his measured breathing, the rise and fall of his chest steady as clockwork. Yet even in the dark, she felt his presence like a weight pressing against her ribs. She turned her face toward the window, moonlight slipping through the curtains, and whispered words she had rehearsed 100 times but never spoken aloud. "Edward, I can't do this anymore." The rhythm of his breathing broke. Slowly he opened his eyes, the whites catching, the faint glow. "Can't do what?" Margaret's hands trembled beneath the sheets where the small recorder lay hidden, red light shielded by fabric. "Live like this, in silence, under your eyes. I feel trapped." Edward propped himself on an elbow, his shadow stretching across her face. His tone was calm, too calm. Trapped? Margaret, you're my wife. You live in comfort and safety. Who has trapped you except your own mind? Her throat tightened, but she forced the words through. I loved someone once. Long before you, it was real, but it ended. You need to know it has nothing to do with now. I've been faithful to you, but I can't keep carrying the guilt in secret. The silence that followed was more dangerous than any scream. Edward's jaw shifted, his calm facade cracking like porcelain under pressure. Someone else. The words were flat, spoken like a verdict. And you thought to confess this now? After years of marriage? Margaret tried to steady her voice. I thought honesty mattered between us. His laugh was short, sharp, bitter. Honesty? Or are you testing me, preparing excuses for whatever you've been hiding? Margaret sat up, her back pressed to the headboard. Edward, please, I've done nothing wrong. I only wanted to tell you the truth. He rose, looming above her, his figure blotting out the thin wash of moonlight. His shadow fell long across the wall. Towering, distorted, his voice dropped to a hiss. You humiliate me in my own home. Do you think I don't see the way men look at you? The way you cling to your secrets? You call this honesty, Margaret? No. This is betrayal. Her pulse hammered. The recorder, beneath the sheets, felt like her only lifeline, her only witness. She clutched it tighter, praying the device caught every word. Edward, stop. But he was already pacing, his calmness shattered, rage simmering just beneath the surface. His fists clenched and unclenched, his breath ragged though he tried to mask it. At last he turned, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. If you are mine, you will prove it. And if you aren't, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. Margaret's eyes glistened in the dark, terror and defiance colliding in her chest. She pressed the recorder tighter. At least now she had proof. Proof of the monster behind the mask. And yet, as dawn crept closer, she feared proof alone would not save her. The recorder was still warm in Margaret's hand when dawn bled through. The curtains. Her eyes ached from lack of sleep, her mind circling the fragments of Edward's outburst, each word a bruise she couldn't erase. She sat upright slowly, careful not to stir him. But as the morning light spread across the bed, her gaze froze. There, stark against the white linen, were stains. Dark, rusted patches of blood seeping into the fibers, sharp and jarring in the pale glow. Her breath hitched. She lifted the sheets back, trembling fingers brushing the fabric as if the stains might vanish under her touch. But they didn't. The blood was real, and it wasn't hers. Edward, she whispered, voice quivering. Edward, what is this? He stirred beside her, slow and deliberate, before opening his eyes. His expression was calm, unbothered, almost rehearsed. I cut my hand last night. Must have bled while I slept. Margaret's gaze darted to his hands. They were smooth, unmarked, no bandage, no sign of injury. Her stomach knotted. You're lying, she whispered, almost to herself. Edward sat up, his movements unhurried, as though time itself bent to his control. He reached for the sheet, examined it briefly, then folded it over to hide the stains. Margaret, you've been tense for weeks, seeing things that aren't there. Do you truly want to invent monsters out of nothing? Her chest tightened. There's blood, Edward. I didn't imagine it. His gaze sharpened. And what will you do with that? Run to your journal? Whisper to the neighbors that your husband bleeds in the night? The words cut deep. He rose. From the bed, his silhouette stretching tall against the morning light, shadow spilling across her. You should rest. You've been fragile, confused. It's why I've had to keep such a close watch on you. For your own good. Margaret's fingers gripped the sheets until her knuckles whitened. Every instinct screamed at her to demand answers, but fear pinned her tongue. As Edward left the room, his footsteps even, controlled, she stared at the linen. The blood was no hallucination. Someone had bled here. The question tore at her mind. Was it him or someone else? Hours later, when she gathered the soiled sheets, she noticed faint smears leading toward the doorframe. a trail barely visible, like a secret half erased. She pressed a hand to her mouth, the taste of iron filling her imagination. A thought gripped her, cold and undeniable. The blood wasn't meant to be hidden. It was meant to be found, and if that was true, then Edward wasn't just lying. He was warning her. The blood-stained sheet still lingered in Margaret's thoughts when the sound came. A sharp knock at the front door, firm and deliberate. She froze on the staircase, clutching the folded linen, heart quickening. Edward appeared from the study, his posture relaxed, though his eyes flicked briefly to her hands before settling on the door. Another knock followed, heavier this time, muffled by the steady patter of rain outside. When Edward opened it, a man stood framed in the doorway, a tall figure in a damp coat, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. His voice was steady, professional. "Detective Inspector Graham Ashcroft. May I come in?" Edward's smile slid effortlessly into place, smooth and warm. "Of course, Inspector. Do step inside. Dreadful weather." Margaret hovered by the banister, the sheets clutched tighter against her chest. Ashcroft stepped into the hallway, water dripping onto the polished wood, his eyes scanning the house with quiet precision. "I'm looking into a missing person," he said, "a woman named Evelyn Clark. She was last seen not far from here." The U.S. Tower. Name struck Margaret like ice in her veins. She glanced at Edward instinctively. His face remained unreadable, calm as still water. "How unfortunate," Edward said evenly. "But I'm not sure how we can help." Ashcroft's gaze lingered. "Mrs. Hale, were you at home 2 nights ago?" Margaret's lips parted, but Edward stepped forward smoothly, shielding her with his presence. "My wife has been unwell. Resting. Mostly. I was here, of course, as always." Ashcroft tilted his head, studying Edward's expression, then shifted his gaze toward Margaret. "And you, madam? Did you see or hear anything unusual?" Her throat tightened. The memory of the blood, stark against white sheets, flashed in her mind. She opened her mouth, but Edward's hand brushed hers, subtle yet commanding. "Nothing. Unusual," she whispered at last, the words tasting like ash. The detective's eyes narrowed as though sensing the fracture between their words. He scribbled a note in his pad, his pen scratching softly. Edward's smile never faltered. "If there's anything we can do to assist, Inspector, you need only ask. We'd be more than willing." Ashcroft closed his notebook, slipping it into his coat. His tone was polite, but there was steel beneath it. "I may have more questions later." As he stepped back into the rain, his silhouette blurred against the gray drizzle. Margaret's nails dug into her palms. She had wanted to speak, to cry, to tell him everything, but Edward's grip had been stronger. The door closed gently, the echo settling like a verdict. Edward turned, smiling faintly. "See, nothing to worry about." But Margaret knew the detective would return. And when he did, silence might no longer be enough to protect her. The echo of Detective Ashcroft's visit had barely faded when the first newspaper headlines appeared. "Local banker questioned in missing woman probe." Edward's name was never printed outright, but the description was unmistakable. Soon cameras crowded the courthouse steps, flashes cutting through drizzle like lightning. Margaret walked beside Edward, her hand hooked into his arm, her face carefully composed. Every step felt rehearsed, as if she were an actress caught in a performance she hadn't agreed to audition for. Inside, the courtroom hummed with whispers. Friends, distant relatives, and curious neighbors filled the benches, their stares heavy with judgment. Edward sat tall, his tailored suit immaculate, his expression carved from stone. Margaret's seat was beside him, but she felt a gulf widening between them, one that no bridge of loyalty could span. The prosecution began not with evidence, but with voices from the past. A family friend, Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb, spoke of Edward's charm, his social ease. But then her voice faltered. There was always a temper, subtle at first, like a storm you thought might pass, but it never truly did. Murmurs rippled through the court. Margaret's stomach turned. She remembered nights of raised voices, slammed doors, apologies spoken too smoothly. Another voice followed. Edward's cousin, Robert Hale. He was clever, yes, always clever, but he kept secrets, even from family. And when Evelyn Clark came into his life, something shifted. He grew darker. Margaret glanced at Edward. His jaw was tight, but his smile lingered, faint and practiced. When it was her turn, the air seemed to still. She rose slowly, feeling dozens of eyes pressing down. The barrister's question was deceptively simple. Mrs. Hale, do you consider yourself a victim or a partner in your husband's actions? Her throat constricted. She saw the recorder. She had hidden weeks ago. The bloodstains, the detective's gaze, her own reflection fractured in a cracked mirror. She wanted to scream the truth, to let it spill across the polished wood of the witness box. Instead, she whispered, I don't know. Gasps fluttered through the gallery. Edward's head turned ever so slightly, his eyes meeting hers. Cold, warning, unreadable. The judge tapped his gavel, restoring order. But the damage was done. In that hesitation, the world saw uncertainty. To the press, it was betrayal. To Edward, perhaps, unforgivable weakness. When court adjourned for the day, the couple stepped back into a storm of flashing lights. The courthouse wall glowed white with each camera flash, the noise deafening. Edward raised a hand, waving off questions with polished grace. Margaret kept her gaze low, the cold rain soaking through her coat. Whispers from the crowd reached her ears. She knows something, she's hiding it. Is she afraid of him or protecting him? By the time they reached the waiting car, Margaret's hands were trembling. She slid into the seat, staring out at the crowd pressing forward, faces blurred by glass and water. Edward leaned close, his voice barely audible over the rain. Loyalty, Margaret. That's all I ask. Do not forget it. His words wrapped around her like a noose, and though the trial was only beginning, she knew her silence could either condemn her husband or destroy her with him. The next morning, the courtroom was suffocating with anticipation. Rain streaked the high windows, the sound like a ticking clock. Margaret sat rigidly at the witness stand, every nerve strung tight. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind, the decision clawing at her for weeks. Edward watched her from his place at the defense table. His composure was impeccable as always, the immaculate suit, the faint, calculated smile. But Margaret could see what others could not, the slight twitch in his jaw, the warning in his eyes. The barrister leaned forward. Mrs. Hale, do you have anything further you wish to present to this court? Margaret's hand trembled as she reached into her handbag. For a moment, silence blanketed the room, broken only by the soft rustle of paper and leather. Then she placed a small recording device on the polished wood. Yes, she whispered. Her voice cracked, but it carried. I kept this, because I knew no one would believe me otherwise. The device crackled to life. Edward's voice filled the chamber, deep and sharp, laced with fury. You belong to me, Margaret. Do you hear me? You'll say nothing, or I'll make sure you regret it. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Edward's mask slipped in an instant. He leaned forward, his eyes burning, his composure fracturing into raw, visible rage. You think this changes anything? His voice thundered, echoing through the room. She's lying, manipulating, twisting words. My wife is not well. She's hysterical. But no one seemed to believe him now. The recording played on, his threats undeniable, his tone venomous. Margaret's heart pounded. She glanced toward the judge, then at the faces in the gallery. Friends, strangers, the detective standing at the back with arms folded. For once, she did not lower her. "And I loved him," she said, voice steadying. "But I will not be silent any longer." Edward rose abruptly, his chair scraping back. The bailiff moved forward, but Edward's glare never left Margaret. For the first time, there was no charm, no disguise, only unmasked hatred. "Traitor," he spat. "After everything you betray me?" Margaret's breath shook, yet she stood taller, hand raised in oath. No, I survive you. The judge's gavel struck hard, calling for order, but the damage was irreparable. The perfect husband was gone. What stood in his place was a man stripped bare, exposed before the world. On the table between them lay their wedding photograph, presented earlier as evidence of a happy marriage. Now it had been torn during the chaos, split neatly down. The middle, husband on one side, wife on the other. Margaret looked at the broken image, then at the man she once thought she knew. Their love story had collapsed under the weight of secrets, lies, and survival, and though the trial was far from over, Margaret understood. She had crossed the final line. There was no turning back. The verdict came down like a hammer striking stone. Guilty. The word reverberated through the courtroom, sealing Edward Hale's fate. He stood motionless as the sentence was delivered, shoulders rigid, eyes fixed on some invisible horizon. Margaret did not dare look at him directly, but she felt the weight of his stare all the same. Heavy, poisonous, unforgettable. 2 days later, the prison doors clanged shut behind him. The once celebrated banker, the man who charmed neighbors and business partners alike, was reduced to a number, his world confined by concrete walls and iron bars. Reporters lingered outside, scribbling stories about the fall of the perfect husband. Margaret, meanwhile, walked free, yet freedom felt less like escape and more like exile. At night she lay awake in the hollow silence of their empty house, the echoes of his voice pressing in around her. "Traitor, you betray me." Those words gnawed at her, even in his absence. She tried to piece together some semblance of normality. She visited her sister briefly, attended church once, even walked through the park where she and Edward had once strolled hand in hand. But everywhere she went, whispers followed. Some pitied her, others questioned her. Was she a victim? Or had she been complicit for too long? One evening, as rain pattered softly against the windows, she stood alone in the sitting room, staring out at the blurred glow of city lights. Her reflection hovered faintly in the glass. Older, wearier, etched with guilt she could not shed. Her hands trembled as she touched the cracked wedding photograph she had salvaged from the courtroom. Half of Edward's face stared back at her, cut off from her own image. She considered throwing it into the fire, but couldn't. To destroy it felt too final, too much like admitting she had never loved him at all. Meanwhile, Edward's life inside prison became its own mythology. Some said he kept silent, withdrawn. Others whispered he boasted of his innocence to anyone who would listen. Margaret didn't know which version was true, but in her dreams, he was always the same. Calm, smiling, promising he'd find a way back. Weeks later, she received a letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. Sharp, precise, every letter carved in ink. She held it over the wastebasket, pulse racing, but in the end she slid it into a drawer, unopened. She could not face his words, not yet. Perhaps not ever. As dawn broke one morning, Margaret stood by the window again. The city stretched before her, vast and indifferent. She was free now, yes, no hand to grip hers, no shadow to dictate her steps. But freedom carried its own chains. Guilt, fear, the memory of blood between the sheets. Her lips moved silently, as if answering a question only she could hear. Was it worth it? Was survival worth betrayal? Behind her, the house groaned in the wind, empty and restless. The story had ended, yet the echo of Edward Hale's voice lingered, a reminder that some cages follow you long after the bars have closed.